Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's session of Meta Theory about transaction cost economics. We're thrilled that you're here for almost the last session that we're holding as a virtual session as part of our 2021-2022 Stronger Together task force and our virtual sessions. As you may have been aware in terms of the processes that we have, like the series, the Meta Theory series, is almost coming to an end after we had run 4 sessions around behavioral strategy, real options, attention-based view, and resources and capabilities. And today we'll focus on transaction cost economics, the 5th theory of this series. But before we get to today's session, since this is the last virtual session for the day, I would like to take a minute and thank Heather for really being the leader that the STR division needed at this time to really oversee all the sessions, deep engagement, attending pretty much every one of these. So I don't know whether we would like to go with a virtual thanks or unmute ourselves and give her a round of applause so that this is more internal. And I hope that at the AOM during our in-person meetings, we can thank you, Heather, for everything that you have done for the division.
Aka, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed it, but thank you very much.
See that. So getting back to today's session, in my role as the STR Executive Committee member, I'm thrilled to kickstart today's session about transaction cost economics. Nuno Oliveira from Tilburg University has kindly accepted to coordinate today's session, really being that foundational thought leadership to put the session together. And we're also joined by Nick Argyres, Fabrice Lumineau, Brian Silverman, and Libby, who have kindly and generously agreed to share their insights and time about the research that has been ongoing and future research opportunities in this area of research. And looking at the audience, like some of you, I'm looking at familiar names who already had contributed and are knowledge experts in the area of transaction cost economics, but just to get a sense of the audience and help our panelists to better orient their discussions for today, there is a poll that I'm going to post in a second. If you could fill out your level of familiarity with TCE theory, you'd appreciate it. The two options here are TCE as one of my primary research areas, and the second option is not a primary research area. I'm here to learn about the theory and its research opportunities. Okay, it looks like that we're getting an answer from almost most of the attendees. I'm gonna let it stay for another 20 seconds or so. Okay, very nice. So let's look at the poll. So as you see on the screen, assume the poll results are visible to everybody. Yep. Okay. So 22% of the audience are already doing research with TCE theory as their primary research area, and 78% are here to learn more about the theory. So as we're going throughout the session, I encourage everybody to post their own insights, their own thought processes in the chat so that we could have a more lively session. These are interactive sessions, and the intention is not just for the panelists to present their ideas. We would welcome to have that interaction. In terms of your questions, please also use the chat to enter your questions. In particular intervals, we'll take a pause to look at them, but please post them as they go. So without further ado, I'll pass this to Nuno. And Nuno, thank you very much for organizing this session.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Mark, it's, I think, great service to all the strategic management researchers. So thank you. It's wonderful. I'm Nuno Oliveira, and I'm going to be the moderator for the session. Let me just start by see if I can share my screen with you. Hopefully you can see it. Yeah. Okay, that should work. Can you see my screen? If someone can just give me Yeah, some indication. Okay, excellent, wonderful, thank you. But any case, focus on the session today. So I want to, because as we just saw, about 22% of the attendees actually, trying to learn or come here to learn about TCE. So I would like to just give you a gentle introduction to TCE, and then I'll pass on to our experts today. So essentially, TCE from its inception really is about a choice in terms of choosing between markets and hierarchies based on the kind of different costs you have to transact. And that has been really the main idea, and actually the work of late Oliveira Williamson, of course, developed TCE much more than compared to what was the initial works, but still, this has been the key idea. So we're really trying to somehow identify what is the best transaction governance mode based on the characteristics of the transaction, and that is something that is rather important. Now, just kind of trying to do some sort of X-ray of this theory. Trying to understand, the nuts and bolts of the theory. So essentially, the unit of analysis that we are interested in is the transaction, and the transaction broadly referring to a transfer of a good or a service. Of course, it's not always very clear how we define the boundaries of the transaction, but that gives an idea what we're looking at. And in particular, we are interested in the attributes of those transactions, and namely asset specificity. So whether you actually have to make specific investments in the context of that transaction, uncertainty, and frequency. Now, as I pointed out in the previous slide, it really is about trying to choose. And here you can see this choice a bit more evidently. So we have the transaction characteristics, and we try to match them in terms of what could be the best means to effectuate this transaction. And then we're talking about governance modes, and we think in terms of hierarchy, in terms of market, and in terms of hybrid. So that's essentially the crux of transaction cost economics. Now, in terms of the predictions, and there's quite a wide set of predictions out there, but just giving a sense of what we're trying to do with the transaction cost economics. For example, as asset specificity increases, transaction costs associated with the market governance tend to increase. And this is essentially, so that's essentially the logic that we have for TCE. Now, what is important to point out is that all these predictions are, have some underlying assumptions. And one of the assumptions being bounded rationality. The second assumption, and perhaps most popular, particularly among critics of TCE, opportunism. And we're going to discuss that a bit more in a second. Now, the question where we are, and I think that's what is fascinating, that we have the opportunity to discuss TCE and also, what have been the accomplishments, but also where we go from here. It depends how you look at it. So it could be the half empty kind of glass person or the half full kind of person. And we have evidence, or at least statements in the literature to support both sides. So whatever side you are in, you can find arguments to support it. So you could argue it's a leading perspective in management, and that is true. If you, for example, look at the number of empirical tests of, that use TCE, but it has been criticized, particularly in terms of the assumptions, of some of the assumptions that have been used. And here I'd like to share a bit more, some of the evidence, because I think evidence could be a good way to try to get some clarity of where we stand in terms of accomplishments of TCE. David and Han did this review of about 60 studies using TCE, a review that was published in Strategic Management Journal, and they do find some variation, but find support, for example, for the fact that asset specificity seems to be one of the best predictors when it comes to the governance mode. And then there are also some, for example, uncertainty not being, not finding as wide support in the empirical studies they analyzed. A couple of years later, some colleagues from Tilburg did a meta-analysis with over 90,000 observations, including over 90,000 observations, and broadly speaking, they would say, well, yeah, we found support also for TCE, and of course, there's some, some specifics and some very nuanced predictions of TCE where the evidence is mixed, which of course is a great way to design future studies. 2 years later, it looks like every 2 years we have a review being published. I'll stop in 2008, so no worries. The assessment was, well, we broadly found support for TCE. And this is something you would find, and I just want to share this with those in the audience who might be interested in, get a quick start with TCE. These are some of the reviews about TCE. And we have different types. So there's reviews about, for example, set specificity, but also the meta-analysis I pointed out. And most recently, and to the best of my knowledge, that the most recent review that was co-authored by Brian Silverman at the Academy of Management Annals, and it's on the top of my table. So for those who are interested, this is, I think, a good way to master TCE in a couple of days, if you will. Now, of course, there's been some controversies, and of course makes the debate very lively, and we enjoy that. And as I preempted, the assumption of opportunism has received wide attention from critics, and as being some sort of extreme caricature of the human nature, and they think that it's not really a very progressive view of humans. Also in terms of empirics, and it's no surprise if your theory is one of the most empirically tested, of course, you also learn what are some of the areas you need to develop. But there's been critics in terms of constructability, and here Kyle Meyer has a wonderful book sharp in 2009 about different constructs using TCE and how they are used in empirical research, and with very specific suggestions to improve constructability. Also in terms, there's been also some work in terms of the hurdles to study opportunism, because of course it's not very straightforward to study. And I particularly like the nuance about implications for practice. I think as strategic management researchers, we kind of ought to think about what does it mean for managers. We're teaching about different theories and we advising managers, but what does it mean? And this has been actually indeed the area where some of the critics of TCE think that TCE is not very helpful because it may actually have a reverse effect. So if you treat, for example, everybody as being opportunistic, it might be that eventually they will behave in an opportunistic way. I'm simplifying the argument, but just to give you a sense of it. Now, the best way to design future research and to rethink about the future is, okay, what are our weaknesses? So we can actually build on these weaknesses or points of controversy to really develop future projects. And there's been some great ideas out there in terms of, for example, really trying to develop a different model of human nature, trying to really reconsider the assumption of opportunism and different types of opportunism, so we can have a more nuanced argument about it. Also in terms of framing, biases, heuristics, so that really is to really delve into the individual and the more cognitive side of and making these decisions about transactions. But we have experts, as we'll see in a second, to talk about this. Adaptation, communication to disturbances that happen in transactions, how we go about to address those. Governance and blockchain, so more flavor of the digitalization aspect here. And more important and more broadly issues, I should say, actually, in terms of, for example, nationalism, which is not a topic that has been widely studied with TCE. You might think is not a natural topic, but turns out to be quite relevant, more so if you are into international business. Issues of sustainability and more broadly, the grand challenges. So clearly, there's a wonderful set of topics one can pursue and think in terms of the future for TCE. Now, I don't want to stand between, just the wonderful set of panelists we have today, and let me just introduce them very briefly and then give the floor to our panelists. So we have Brian Silverman, which is a professor of strategic management at the University of Toronto. We have Nick Argyres, which is a professor of strategy at Washington University at St. Louis. We have also Fabrice Lumineau from the University of Hong Kong. And we have Libby from the University of California at Irvine. And they have a wonderful track record of contributions to TCE. They know TCE inside out. And the wonderful thing about it is that I actually don't know very much what they're going to be talking about. So like the audience, I'm very curious to know what they're going to be talking about. And without any further ado, I'd like to give the floor to them. And we will proceed in the following order. Brian will go first, followed by Nick, then Fabrice, and last but definitely not least, Libby Weber will conclude the set of presentations. So should I just, Brian, just take over from here? And I'll stop sharing my screen, which clearly didn't go, yeah.
Okay. So there are my slides, which I hope you can see now. And let's see if I have luck. Good. excuse me, I'm sorry, you're going to have to listen to me cough a little bit. It was my turn to have COVID about a month ago, and it was easy, but I have this residual thing. So that'll just, you'll cut that out, each cough out of the whatever you post on YouTube. Anyway, thanks. It's great to be here with you. Thanks so much for inviting me. I see myself as a bit of a bridge between Nuno's very nice intro and what the others will be talking about. I'm sort of setting the stage with a little more detail on transaction cost economics. I'll give an example and try to walk through it, and then sort of push it on to the other people. So I may go quickly through some of this because Nuno already touched on a lot of this, but I do want to hit on a couple of things. So the key point of transaction cost economics, the primary hypothesis, is this idea that organizational actors try to economize on the cost of transacting or the cost of exchange by assigning the transactions, which differ in their attributes, to governance structures, and the governance structures have different abilities to manage things in a discriminating way. And Nuno's already talked about the attributes that matter in this field: asset specificity, uncertainty, frequency, and I would add after that, appropriability came a little later. Appropriability is good. Low appropriability and the high risk of being expropriated is bad. And the basic idea is the greater the level of any of these in any transaction we do, and again, I'll be getting to an example in a second, the greater the level of these, the more likely that the most efficient way to organize or govern this transaction is through bringing it inside the same firm rather than using contracts and alliances or somewhere in the middle. Now, as Nuno pointed out, the theory rests on these two behavioral assumptions of bounded rationality and opportunism. Let me just take a second and talk about why. Imagine a world where you and I are transacting. This means we're exchanging for anything we want to exchange on. And we are fully rational, no boundedness at all. Well, then we can causelessly look ahead, anticipate every contingency that could happen, write it down in a contract and agree to it. Voila. Organization has no purpose when there's fully rational people in the world. But in a world of boundedly rational people, we can't think of all the contingencies, and so contracts can break down, and that's where organization becomes interesting. Opportunism, just to be clear, the idea of opportunism is that some small portion of people in the world sometimes will choose to take advantage of situations for their own self-interest. And they may not advertise that fact up front. They may not tell you, I'm going to screw you over, right? And in a world where that weren't the case, in a world where everybody always fulfilled their promises entirely, no matter what, then again, organization doesn't matter, because we can just get together and say, who knows what curveballs life will throw at us during our transaction over the years that we're doing it. I solemnly swear that I will work with you to, reach the best mutual outcome we can. Voila, we're done. But in a world where you can't rely on every single person to always do that, we need to put safeguards in place to try to encourage people to behave the way that we'd like them to, and protect ourselves in case they don't. Now, opportunism, as Nuno pointed out, has received over the years a lot of flack. I will point out that the two of the folks that you cited, Perro and Gauchon Moran, if you look at the paper that Kuipers and Hennart and Ertug and I just did, we went back and read some of that stuff, and what's fascinating is those pieces do a very nice job of creating straw men by rewriting what Oliver says and then attacking the rewrites rather than dealing with what Oliver actually said. It's always easy to knock down a straw man. I understand that sometimes people get the sense that the theory touts the fact, celebrates opportunism. No, we teach accounting fraud in business schools, as Joe Mahoney points out. That doesn't mean it's not a how-to manual. We're trying to say, how do you deal with that? We talk about insurance and how to insure against risks a lot. That's not because we like fires. It's we're trying to figure out how, fires can happen. You want insurance. Safeguards in transaction cost economics, as Joe Mahoney says, are another form of insurance. So there you go. Happy to talk more about that later. Here's the example, just to give you a sense of it, especially for those 78% who haven't really spent much time with this before. Why does asset specificity, especially in conjunction with uncertainty, matter? Here I am. I make furniture in a factory near Chicago, and I ship a lot of it there's big demand for it in New Orleans. I have no idea why. And I ship the stuff usually on barges on the mighty Mississippi River. And they're fine, but they're not that fast and they're kind of unreliable. You run a railroad that goes from New Orleans up to somewhere close to Chicago, not right where my factory is, which is in an isolated place, by the way. but close, 50 miles away. So I say to you, hey, why don't you build a rail spur for 50 miles out to my plant? And after you build it, I will ship my furniture down to New Orleans. Sounds like a good deal. And the prices we're talking about suggest that, you can make money. You have to spend a lot up front, but you'll make money in the end. So, are you ready to do this handshake deal with me? I'm guessing most of you are not. Now, why not? Because you're concerned that after you build this rail spur for many, many millions of dollars, I might not come through with all of the, on handshake deal, I might not come through with all of the stuff I've promised. Now, by the way, is that opportunism? Or is that real life? I don't know. So maybe you say, well, if you give me certain contractual terms that protect me, then I'd be willing to do this. Maybe you have to ship, Brian, you're gonna have to ship, 100,000 carloads at $10,000 each in each of 10 years, and then I would feel secure. Now that's fine. Now, of course, the more those are loaded up, the more I get a little nervous because, okay, I'm going to guarantee these things, these shipments, but what if your service level isn't that good? Now I'm stuck, I have to do this. So I start saying, okay, fine, but now we have to have provisions that say you meet certain service levels, that protects me, but you're wondering, is Brian going to use that if things go bad to sort of renege on the deal? You can see how we might be able to come up with contractual terms that satisfy both of us. And in fact, that's great if we can, but we might not. If we're at a point where we can't agree on these things, then you might ultimately, then the deal doesn't get done, or I buy you and now I'm running a railroad, or maybe more likely, I build the rail spur myself if it's that important to me. So I've now integrated it into having a little bit of a railroad. I connect to your rail line. There's still a contractual issue to make sure that stuff moves, but the good deal gets done. I had to integrate to do it. So if that gives, that's the flavor of transaction cost economics. The more contractual hazards, the more likely something goes into vertical integration. And if you can do it in contracts, it's usually more efficient to do it that way. And things that create these contractual hazards include asset specificity. This rail spur just coming to me. Now, what if there were 50 factories right next to me? You might not care so much. If I ended up not being such a great customer, you have others. So it's the asset specificity part that plays a role. Now let's add to this uncertainty that Nuno talked about. You can imagine a world where the barge operators, for some reason, we think they're like robots, they won't change anything. Or you can imagine a world where they might try to come back with creative ways to get my business, new technology or so on. Does that matter? Well, the more uncertainty, the more you think they might be able to come back and tempt me, the more you might be concerned that I will have reasons to renege on the deal that were put in place. So it's the uncertainty in conjunction with asset specificity that increases this hazard. Notice if it were just uncertainty with no asset specificity, there's the 50 factories there. Now you might not get to keep me because of the uncertainty, these barges, but if you have 49 other potential customers that you're working with, no big deal. So uncertainty on its own isn't really an issue. It's when it's with asset specificity. Anyway, this is just a rhetorical thing, but should we be surprised if I try to renegotiate? You've built this thing, my demand in New Orleans goes down or something, and I try to renegotiate. Is that surprising in the world that we know? To me, no, but I'm from New York. Maybe it's surprising to other people. Does it matter if we call that opportunism or not? Is that like a bad ideology? I'll leave that to you. So that's just to give you an example of how this stuff works. Foundational work here, and I'll go pretty quickly here, I think. There's been a ton of work. I'll just point out kind of the path of how this work went. That's probably more important than what the work is itself. Coase and Williamson, of course, we've already heard from Nuno, foundational stuff. Coase asks the question about markers and hierarchies, but it has sort of a tautological answer. Williamson fleshes out the theory, mostly around vertical integration at the beginning. Thies, you think of him as the dynamic capabilities guy now. He was actually, his first claim to fame was he was the guy that was doing empirical tests of transaction cost economics. He also extended it to thinking about horizontal diversification and the international world. Jean-Francois Hanard also brings this into the international environment. Erin Anderson does great work taking this to marketing. Gary Pisano, I think, is the first person to explicitly use transaction cost economics logic, thinking about alliances as a midpoint or a point on the continuum between markets and hierarchies. Joanne Oxley does what I think is the first study of appropriability, the empirical study of it. All of that's about the organization form. If you see transactions looking this way, you should expect to see firms organizing this way. But there's a big question in strategy, the so what question. Does it matter for performance? And there's been a more recent literature that looks at performance consequences. And I won't go through all of these, but they're different bites at the apple for trying to find creative ways to say, for firms that are aligned improperly according to the Gospel of Williamson, does it matter? And the answer is generally yes. Firms tend to have lower profits, higher costs, they die more readily. So there are these performance consequences. That's another piece that's come up. That gives you a flavor for a lot of this. Two more things I want to do. I want to point out all the different fields. I won't list them, read them all. You can read them faster than I can. But to give a sense of the vast scope of influence that transaction cost economics has had on vertical integration, of course, the canonical problem according to Williamson, but almost everything else we talk about in strategy, diversification, alliances, entrepreneurship, innovation, IB. Outside of strategy, you see things such as supply chain management, not surprisingly, big impact in marketing and law, and a huge range of human activity. There's even a paper that tries to explain the diffusion of engagement rings, diamond engagement rings in the US in the 1930s based on TCE logic. It's a wonderful paper by Margaret Brinnick. The theory has been explicitly integrated with other theories, which both helps TCE to get stronger and helps inform the other theories. If you look at things like citations, the impact still seems to be largest in TCE, largest in strategy. And if I have another minute and a half, which I think I do, I'll just give my 4 thoughts on where to go from here. I think the next folks will be spending more time on that part. I'm pretty excited at the idea of thinking about organizational change in TCE. So do they organize in a certain way? Yes. Does it matter? That's performance consequences. Now we know yes. Well, if a firm's misaligned, why doesn't it change then? If it's misaligned and there's a performance consequence, why doesn't it change? There's been a bit of work. I've done a little, Nick's done a little, that looks at the role of adjustment costs and other constraints in facilitating or slowing down improvements to alignment by firms. I think there's a lot of room to move there, both on change. It'll help both TCE and organizational change. We tend to think about the boundaries of the firm with TCE, but there's been some very exciting work on intra-firm organization. It gives some predictions for how the outcomes we would expect from different ways of organizing. 2 things I'll mention, there's been a lot of work on centralization versus decentralization of R&D, of innovation, for example. And I think that's quite useful, but you can think of that for a lot of things beyond R&D. People tend to focus on that because it's easy to look at patents, but there's a lot more you can do. I'm very excited by the work by Katie Magelson and colleagues looking at, we think of firms versus contracts. They find that firms use contracts internally, which is something that you wouldn't expect, and they're coming up with very interesting things. I'll put a shout out for cognition in TCE. I won't say more about it because Libby's going to talk about it later, I suspect. I'm also intrigued by the recent work on culture and values in firms. I wonder if there's a way to connect that to efficient governance. Firms with certain values, do they have different ways of contracting, different efficiencies of contracting than firms with other types of values? In my mind, this goes back to a debate that went on in 1996 that I won't belabor right now, but I think there may be room to take TCE to this culture and values work that's being done now that's quite exciting. Finally, if you're interested in any more basic background on TCE, about 10 years ago, for some French university, the University of Dauphine, I made these 3 videos of about 8 minutes each. They're on YouTube. I don't get any of the royalties from Grammarly that seems to have ads on all of that, but please feel free to watch them if you'd like to see more. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Any questions any pressing questions from the audience that we have? If not, I suggest we move on and give the floor to Nick Argyres. Is that good? Yeah, let's do that. And hope we can have some questions that cut across different presentations as well. Oh, someone was raising their hand. I'd be happy to take one question. It gives you the feeling of a discussion going on, so that's good.
Yes, actually, I had a quick question.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for the excellent presentations. I'm just wondering that, well, one of the assumptions of TCE is risk neutrality. And we know that, as long as I know, there is no empirical investigation of this assumption of TCE, risk neutrality. I'm just, this is always in my mind that no studies have looked into it, what if, for example, empirical investigations or studies would show us something else. or which definitely it would be probably is the case. And I just want to know the idea or opinion of the panelists on this assumption of TCE. Thank you very much.
Brian would like to take this
I'll go
question?
first just because since I had already spoken. So yeah, I have to say, I don't think of that as an assumption on which the theory rises or falls. I think of it's sort of simplifying, and others on the panel may disagree. I think of it as a way of simplifying some of the work to focus on certain issues that Williamson originally and then others wanted to follow. There may well be room to relax that and see how it would affect the theory. Certainly, formally, you could do formal models of that and then see what happens empirically. I don't want to put her on the spot now, but maybe later Libby might have something to say about that, because it sounds like it touches a bit on some of the cognitive stuff that I'm guessing she might be talking about. So that's all I've got.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks very much. Nick, the floor is yours. Apologies for slight delay. Yeah, we see your slides.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So
perhaps, sorry to interrupt, perhaps you could try to up them on a presentation mode. And I should not say this because it went pretty bad for me, but yeah, wonderful, brilliant.
okay, thank you, Nuno. So I'm going to follow Brian by drilling down a little bit on one area where I think there's a lot of research opportunities in related to TCE, and it's going to overlap a little bit with Brian's list of potential research opportunities. And I certainly agree with all of the ones he listed. I just happened to be interested in this one and picked it out, not because I think it's the best new research opportunity or the only one, but it's an interesting one. And I think there are different ways to get at it that I wanted to talk to you about. And I'm going to refer a little bit to my own work about this as well. So the topic is TCE and informal organization. So Williamson's major book, in his 1975 book, he makes this more or less the statement that atmosphere matters, but I don't know how to deal with it. What he means by atmosphere is the sense that one gets working in an organization. That's not written down in any formal way, but the feeling one gets, the way people behave. Maybe it's about culture. And Williamson read very widely, so he knew that atmosphere matters, but he did, as he said, he didn't quite know how to deal with it. By 1991, he had long forgotten about atmosphere and was basically claiming that the best strategy a firm can do is to match the formal governance structures that it chooses with the transaction characteristics that it's facing, exactly as Nuno and Brian has talked about. So it's back to the very formal idea of markets or hierarchies or hybrids. But I think we all have the sense in strategy that formal kind of structures are probably easier to imitate than informal things. And if they're easier to imitate, maybe there's less opportunity for competitive advantage. If it's about matching governance structures and transaction characteristics, and everybody knows the theory, why can't all firms do it and then nobody gets an advantage? That's probably a strong, maybe overly strong concern. But still, we do have a lot of literature that suggests that the informal things are harder to imitate. There's a famous quote from Peter Drucker, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So my question is, after 47 years of saying we don't know how to deal with it, are we ready to tackle informal as organization 47 years later? Let me say what I mean by informal organization. I'm going to talk about a few things. First, informal communication by actors that is not prescribed by an organization. So sort of rules out a lot of the formal information processing literature. That's really about how information travels down the formal hierarchy. I'm talking about informal communication. Social networks, which is one of the ways that informal communication actually happens. Social networks can be partly formal, but they also could be informal in their community. They could be pipelines. I'm going to talk about informal incentives, and I'm going to talk briefly about informal authority. So none of these things I think TCE deals with explicitly, but I think with some extensions, we could better understand organizations and organizational performance if we better understood the roles of these informal organization in strategy and performance. So informal communication, we've long known that communication channels are one of the things that distinguishes organizations from just market kind of structures. They're described organizational channels. There's some very intriguing work based on the idea that maybe organizations exist because they can better, not because they reduce opportunism or mitigate it, but because they transfer knowledge better than markets, and maybe they do that because there's some special kind of language that exists in organizations that doesn't exist between them. That idea was thrown out there, particularly by Nonaka, who gives some nice examples of language, but not very comparative. So most of the discussion was about how organizations transfer knowledge and use language, not so much about how that happens in other governance structures. So in that sense, not comparative, but still they raise a provocative question that I think really has not been quite addressed. In recent work with Nuno and Fabrice, the other panelists, we've looked at communication style across different projects and suggested that that can really matter for how well a project is managed. What I mean by communication style is what is said or not said, and actually how it is said. And that's something also outside the scope of TCE, but one can imagine asking a question, do different governance structures enable different kinds of informal communication? And in so doing, have some kind of performance consequences. Social networks, as I mentioned before, think about them, you can think about them as communication pipelines. They're structures that direct communication. There could be formal aspects to them. They could also be informal. And so a natural question, I think, is how do social networks interact with formal governance structures? Does one condition the other, and with what performance consequences? And Brian mentioned this paper, I think, with he and I and Luis Rios, where we looked at how the impact of centralizing your R&D structure on the informal network of inventors, and show that there is an impact, and that there, in turn there's an impact on innovation. So that was looking at the interaction between a formal structure that Williamson talked about and the informal structures that folks who study social networks emphasize so much. Informal incentives. Now, Williamson talks a lot about incentives when he talks about, certainly in contracts, one way to achieve some sort of safeguards is to have appropriate incentives in contracts. He also talks about the fact that internal organization can never deliver as strong incentives as a market contract can. So Williamson does talk about incentives, but very much in a formal way where the incentives are contracted explicitly and written down. However, there is a large literature in economics about relational contracts. Now I'm talking about the economics version of that idea. And that literature emphasizes the role of informal incentives, incentives that are not written down anywhere or even legally enforceable, but might be used to ensure to achieve some kind of cooperation that you couldn't achieve without those informal incentives, because maybe the formal incentives are difficult to enforce or are subject to the kinds of bounded rationality and incompleteness that Brian talked about. There is growing evidence that these relational contracts do exist between firms. I would say growing evidence, not extensive evidence. So we still want to know how widespread are these kind of relational contracts using informal incentives. Now, what do you mean let me say a little bit more what I mean by an informal incentive. It's a financial payment or a bonus or giving another party something of value in exchange for their cooperation, but where there's no legal enforceability or even formal understanding of those bonuses or payments. So we want to know how often are they used, where are they not used? Could they even be used within organizations? And that's been a strong suggestion of some of the founders of this literature, like Bob Gibbons, who's very interested in whether relational contracts can be observed in organizations, and then with what performance consequences. And finally, I'll talk about informal authority. What I mean by informal authority is inside an organization, there may be people who have influence on other organization members, but they're not necessarily that high in the hierarchy. And they could affect organizational decision-making by virtue of their influence. For example, it was long known that some engineers at Boeing, some of the engineers who designed the early Boeing jets, 707 and the 727, refused to go into management because they were devoted to the engineering profession, but were so respected that when management would try to make some design decision on an aircraft, they could push back and usually stop that decision because the other engineers respected them so much. So Williamson doesn't talk much about informal authority. It's more the role of authority as a fiat. But what if you have what if organizational leaders abuse their authority and lead the organization down a wrong path? Some organizations have informal leaders that can check the authority of the formal leaders, and with what performance consequences? There's a famous paper by Argyres and Tirole about this, and I wrote about this a little bit myself in my a paper where I, with Violaine Mouy, modeled this idea that informal leaders can help to constructively dissent against poor strategies. So companies may want to allow for informal leadership. Okay, so I tend to think that it would be great if TCE could incorporate a little bit more about informal organization. I think that would be important for understanding organizational performance and strategy and broaden the theory in a way that I think Williamson wanted to do early on, but just found it very difficult to do. And I think now we have more to work with 47 years later, more research to work with than he did back then. On the other hand, there are challenges. The data on informal organization is often not easily just downloadable or accessible. On the other hand, people have studied emails. They have studied meeting notes. I fear today there's so much data available just that you could just download off the internet that people don't want to quite invest in the more difficult to access data. So that's a challenge. But I do think that there are payoffs there. And what I try to say to students is that if you want to this doesn't have to be your whole research portfolio. You could think of part of your work as working with data that you download from the internet, and part of your portfolio as work that you try to get inside organizations and get more data that's more microanalytic and closer to detail, the kind of detail that you need for applying TCE, which would include case studies and theory building. So happy to address questions later, and I will pass it back to Nuno.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Talking about data on the internet, perhaps it's time to move to a presentation of Fabrice Lumineau, who will tell us about digitalization, I believe. Fabrice.
Can you see my slides?
Can see the slides, and they look awesome.
Okay, great. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much to Heather, Maka, Nuno, the STR Division for organizing this very interesting session. So today I want to give you an overview of the relationship between TCE and technologies. And I will specifically focus on the digital technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. And I like what I believe are interesting direction for future research around like some of the TCE topics. So first, it's important to keep in mind that TCE has always discussed the potential impact of technology. For instance, in his seminal article in 1937, Ronald Coase was already observing the importance of core technologies of his day, the telephone and the telegraph, in influencing firm boundaries. And in turn, there is a whole stream of research which has applied TCE insights to analyze the impact of new technologies, such as Clemens and colleagues in 1993 in information systems, who observed that information technology has the ability to lower coordination cost without increasing the associated transaction risk, so leading to more outsourcing and less vertically integrated firms. Nick's articles in 1999, looking at the economic processes through which information technology may facilitate coordination, both within and between firms. In their SMJ 2009, Adner and Kapoor integrate arguments from research on technology life cycles and TCE, and they try to understand value creation in innovation ecosystems. Or NR 2019, who analyzes business models used by digital service multinationals. So here on this slide, there are just a few examples from what I think is a very rich and exciting field of research at the intersection between transaction cost analysis and technological changes. So, as you know, we are currently living in the digital age. What I mean by that, the digital age broadly refers to the wave of digitalization across many industries. It includes different technologies such as blockchain, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, among others. And one of the key features behind these different technologies is a convergence of computation, networking, and physical processes. And in particular, digitalization enables a wide diversity of new business models, which imply also different logics of value creation. And importantly, I think that the digital age should lead us, strategy scholars, to revisit some of the assumptions and applications of TCE, as I'm going to explain and illustrate with a case of blockchains. So to be sure we are on the same page, a blockchain is a cryptography-based decentralized system consisting of an ongoing list of digital records that are shared within a peer-to-peer network. And in recent years, blockchains have been seen as a new way of solving problems, like in many industries, especially regarding to recording, tracking, verifying, aggregating various types of information. And to be sure, blockchains have now progressed way beyond cryptocurrencies to organize transactions in many fields and applications, such as payment processing in the finance and insurance industry, tracking songs in the music industry, or tracing bills of lading in the transportation industry, for instance. Okay. And when you look at blockchain, they are supported by two fundamental features: decentralized consensus and machine-based automation. And as such, blockchains represent what I think is a unique approach for achieving both cooperation, and coordination. So on the one hand, especially with smart contracts embedded in blockchain, it can enable automated transactions when certain conditions are triggered by information feeds. So the automatic execution of transactions, combined especially with the merits in blockchain of decentralization, enables immutable records and prevents against unilateral human change. So records are not only virtually impossible to tamper with, because no one can deliberately distort the established information, but they're also easily traceable. So therefore, especially when you relate to TCE, ex post opportunistic behaviors are more easily detectable. On the other hand, blockchains also offer promising possibilities for facilitating coordination. For instance, you look at Walmart, they have launched a food supply blockchain to improve the traceability of its products. And using this blockchain to organize transactions with its suppliers not only prevents opportunism from deceitful suppliers, that is integrity issues, but also helps to quickly identify as well as pass certain information to those who just did something wrong and want to remedy the mistakes. That is competence issues as well. So blockchains enable the parties to identify how the protocol defines responsibilities for tasks. So in other words, accountability. And it makes sure that the tasks are performed in a pre-planned manner. That is like more predictability. So in other words, when you look at blockchain, it supports both procedural and structural coordination. So what I think is intriguing and exciting when you look at a new technology like blockchain is that it helps transacting parties to achieve cooperation and coordination, but in a way that is not analogous to either contractual or relational governance. So among the different ways in which the three governance mechanisms differ, a fundamental difference, I think, relates to their modes of enforcement. So for instance, in the event of a breach of contract, the law awards the injured party access to legal remedies, such as reparation or cancellation, okay? Relational governance in contrast, is based on the patterns of behaviors to which parties are expected to conform, like more like social norms or trust. And relational governance rests on enforcement through what we call the shadow of the future, or the threat of terminating the collaboration between the parties. By contrast, blockchain is a self-contained and autonomous system of formal rules. So blockchains rely on a set of protocols, and these rules are developed through formal programming languages, such as Ethereum Solidity, just to give you one example. So in other words, blockchain can minimize opportunism by a combination of public transparency, but also where it's coupled with cryptographic enforcement and execution through smart contracts, okay? So in blockchain-based technologies, the electronic records are not only virtually impossible to tamper with, but they're also easily traceable. So in turn, opportunistic behaviors are thought at least easily detectable, if not altogether preventable. So again, what I think is very interesting here is that the increasing use of blockchains invite us to rethink the place of opportunism in TC. And also because of its unique technological features, blockchain are also likely to impact the level of cost which are necessary to organize a transaction. Okay, so in other words, blockchain are likely to impact in a unique way the different types of transaction costs. So let me briefly explain. So firstly, when setting up a transaction, distinguishing partners will behave opportunistically from those who will not is a critical step, when you start any kind of exchange. It also creates non-trivial searching costs, specifically, the transaction cost of gathering information to identify and evaluate potential partners. And blockchain can precisely help to lower such costs because I mentioned the mechanical execution, which is inherent to smart contracts. So because of that, there is a willingness of the party when they enter into a smart contract, it can be seen as a pre-commitment not to behave opportunistically in the future. Secondly, transaction costs also include designing costs, like the second stage, which are the costs associated with negotiating and writing an agreement. And here, codifiability refers to the ability to precisely characterize in electronic formats the specified products, delivery, settlement requirements in a manner that all the parties can understand. And here a main challenge for the efficient use of blockchains relates to the possibility to codify the transaction into computer code, because it's what's underlying in a blockchain. Okay. Thirdly, we have the monitoring stage, okay, and the monitoring costs. So here it refers to the cost associated with monitoring the agreements to ensure that each party in the transaction fulfills their set of obligations. And here again, blockchain can be particularly useful because blockchain facilitates real-time, transparent, verified information sharing among the transacting parties. And such data integrity and also reliability can support and improve detection of opportunism, while also mitigating the monitoring cost. And finally, we have the enforcement costs, which are the costs associated with ex post bargaining with and also sanctioning a partner when this partner doesn't perform according to the agreements. So the high transparency of secure data in blockchain greatly simplify, I think, dispute resolution. However, it's also important to keep in mind at the same time that the relevance of blockchain as an efficient mechanism that reduces ex post transaction cost is constrained by the level of verifiability of the transaction. So in sum, blockchain governance may potentially reduce searching cost, monitoring cost, enforcement cost, but tend to imply in general like relatively higher designing cost. Okay. So just like, of course, like other governance mechanisms, blockchain are not able to govern, all types of transactions equally well. And as you can see in the table here, it's also possible to make a distinction in terms of the level of tacitness of the transaction and also the difficulty to communicate information between partners. So to conclude, I would like to highlight a few points. Digital transformation helps us probe the boundary conditions of TCE. And the case of blockchain, I think, is just one illustration of the far-reaching consequences of digital technologies on TCE. So as I discussed, blockchains have the potential to reduce behavioral uncertainty, and therefore, I think, raises interesting questions regarding both the likelihood and the manifestations of opportunism, which, as we discussed previously, is one of the pillars of TCE, one of the central assumptions in TCE. But you can also think, for instance, that artificial intelligence, it may reduce some of the limitations of bounded rationality in terms of learning, processing speed, memory or computation, but also at the same time, it can exacerbate some cognitive biases. So again, I think it's also another very interesting direction when you think at the interface between new technologies and TCE and some of the fundamental assumptions in TCE. In addition, digital technologies tend to reduce both internal and external transaction costs. So there are, I think, arguments to support both an expansion and also a contraction of firm boundaries and the scope of the firm. And I think, again, like there are many opportunities, both theoretical and empirical, which exist to get a better understanding of these issues. And more broadly, I think the rise of new technologies and business model, especially those introduced by the digital economy, they represent opportunities to revisit existing management theories, especially TCE, and also how they apply in new or new non-traditional contexts. But in conclusion, I would say despite all the changes brought by digital transformation, TCE still provides, I think, a useful lens to help, especially strategy scholars, to understand the organization of economic activity. So TCE is dead, maybe, but long life TCE. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fabrice. Thanks very much. Very interesting presentation. There was a question in the chat, and I was tempted to ask about it, and it's maybe a bit controversial. So what's the best way to measure transaction costs? And if I heard you correctly, you made the point that blockchains could be a great way to actually reduce transaction costs. Any thoughts on that? I'm sorry to that you are the lucky presenter to answer that question, but the presenters are welcome to chip in as well, of course.
Okay, so first, there are surprisingly few papers trying to directly measure the cost. I think, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, but so second point, I think it helps to disentangle what you're trying precisely to measure and evaluate, especially in an empirical way. So, for instance, in the typology I presented, it's usual to disentangle the different transaction costs by the different stages of the transaction. But I think as an empirical scholar, I think it's important to be sure that you are clear about what you're trying to measure, and especially how you're going to measure, at which stage, for how long. Is it at the firm level, at the transaction level, at the international level? I think there are some question, at least some starting points to keep in mind when you're trying to evaluate transaction costs.
Thank you, Fabrice. I see someone raising their hand, so maybe we can take one question just before we move on. Just unmute yourself and ask your question. We have some difficulties to hear you, at least on my end. I don't know for others. Okay, so no, we'll try a bit later. Definitely we can pick up your question. There's no problem at all. There's questions about blockchain. So Fabrice, I think you intrigued quite a few attendees. That's great. So about the possibility of digital technologies, for example, artificial intelligence, if they could make some variables, I believe. It's about the effect of certain of the variables used in TCE as not being as linear effects, but more curvilinear. I suspect the question is essentially how can these new technologies nuance or call for developments of TCE more generally?
Right, just a quick correction. I think it's an interesting insight because I think the impacts of new technologies are going to be ambivalent, especially on the transaction cost. For instance, as I quickly pointed out in my conclusion, when you think at artificial intelligence, it can help transacting parties in many ways, especially to mitigate some of the challenges related to bonded rationality. But at the same time, especially when you think at the algorithm underlying some new technologies, it may exacerbate some issues. So I think it goes both ways, and I don't know if it will be a curvilinear effect or some other effects, but I think it's important to be careful about the ambivalence of those technologies.
Thank you. Thanks, Fabrice. So talking about intelligence and bonded rationality, I think is the perfect bridge to the last but definitely not least presentation by Libby Weber. And probably I guess there is something about cognition and something about the individual and the importance of individual aspects and psychology in transactions. So Libby, please, the floor is yours. And yeah, we see your slides in good condition. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to start by saying a caveat, much like Brian's. I also had COVID, but I'm not yet negative. So I'm going to go through this as best I can. I had some very grand plans to do a lot of investigation on this, and COVID struck me down. So hopefully I can say something of some interest here today. You'll notice that I'm calling this behavioral governance, and it is, for me, not something that's separate from TCE, but essentially shining a light on what we can do with TCE when we're augmenting it with psychology. So let me jump in and start talking about this a little bit. So the first thing that I want to say is that I'm essentially a TCE geek, okay? I love this theory so much. It's incredibly valuable. It's something that I think has been put together with such precision, and I love the way that the predictions flow very easily from all of these assumptions and variables coming together. I love it so much, in fact, that I named my dog Oliver even, and you can see that He's in a very abused animal here in his Christmas pajamas, getting treats out of his advent calendar. So with all of this love that I have for TCE, there might be some question about why am I screwing with it, right? Because that's what I've done pretty much my entire career, is go in and look at all of the assumptions of TCE and push on them and prod them and see what we can do with them, essentially. And so in thinking about that, the reason that I've been so obsessed with, looking at these assumptions is because I think it allows TCE to do even more than it's done. And we've seen all the things that it's done. Brian went through all of the traditional things. Nick took us through all of these extensions that have been done and are possible, right? Fabrice is pointing us into an entirely new direction, thinking about digital technologies in the digital age. But even, beyond that, I think that augmenting TCE with psychology, and not just cognition, but psychology more broadly, can allow us to address some of these classic critiques that we've seen. It can also allow us to reframe raging debates, right, that have been going on in the field for a while. And interestingly, it can help us actually make connections to things that we don't think typically that we can make connections to, which is why I love that Nick brought up atmosphere. I was actually reading about atmosphere last night, as a matter of fact, thinking about how interesting and what an opportunity that is for bringing psychology into TCE as well. So let me just start by saying, this is the reality of inter-firm relationships, right? We tend to think of them on the top level, right, as firm to firm, but that's not really what's going on here, right? And even within firms, we tend to think of it as groups working together, but there are individuals underlying all of this. So this actually allows us to take these behavioral assumptions that Williamson had brought into the theory, recognizing that individuals were involved in these decisions, and actually really take them seriously. And so I think that based on this idea, right, there's a need to augment TCE with psychology, but we also have to aggregate to understand this impact at the firm level. If we were just looking at individuals inside of organizations and applying psychology, but just stopping with how it impacts the individual, that's not really telling us much about governance, right? And so we really need to bring it up then to what is the firm level impact. So I'm actually going to give you some potential avenues and guidelines based on my own experiences with doing this. And, successes and failures of doing this and what I've heard from the reviewers, et cetera, because I can't just point to one thing and say, bring attribution in, right? There is a wide open field of what we can actually be bringing in. So the first thing I would say is know the theory, know it backwards, forwards, inside out. If I had my copy of Economic Institutions of Capitalism here and opened it up for you, it is written entirely, right? I've read it over and over and over and over because I keep going back and I keep finding new nuggets there that Williamson had already thought of, right? That I'm like coming to realize as I'm reading something else. So I encourage you to go back and keep reading the theory. But then look at those assumptions, right? I'm going to show you some examples of where Williamson made very specific assumptions for very specific reasons. And because we've gotten all of these critiques, it's been honestly awesome as a scholar who's come along later because you can look at exactly why he made the decisions that he made. Most of them make perfect sense, right? In thinking about what he was trying to accomplish with the theory. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we can accomplish with the theory. And so that will allow you to look back at some of these definitions that he's provided or some of these characterizations of these assumptions and think about how can we change these. It goes back to the question about risk, right? Risk aversion. that's something that's an assumption here. You can change that. See what happens to the theory. The other thing I would say that's really important is there's a lot of implicit assumptions that we don't recognize, either in the work that Williamson did or work that's followed Williamson's based on the theory. And we just kind of accept those implicit assumptions when we're reading the articles. But if we really dig down deep, we can say, well, you know, why did people think that contracts would harm trust? Why did people think that contracts would help trust? Dig down deeper and figure out what those implicit assumptions are. And now you can change those, right? You can add something onto that, and that can actually reveal something that we didn't know before. The other thing is that, and this is actually what got me into this in the beginning, I was negotiating contracts as a VP of marketing for a very small software firm. And I would come out of some of these negotiations after we had belabored a particular clause for hours, right? Putting in all of these penalties. And I would just come away from that thinking, I don't want to work with this client anymore, right? This isn't a good relationship that we're having. So there are all of these psychological impacts that these governance forms have that we can dig down more deeply into. Now, some guidelines based on my own experiences. So be very clear about your level of analysis when you're doing this, because we're talking about individual assumptions when we're bringing in contracting, which Williamson was as well. But again, we have to aggregate this in some way to the firm level for this to be talking about governance. And then the other thing, and this is the best advice a reviewer ever gave me, even though it wasn't the advice I wanted to hear at the time, is make sure that if you're going through all of this work of bringing in this cognition, that you're actually saying something new, right? If we come out of the end of your paper and we don't know anything new, you've done an awful lot of work without actually really giving us much contribution here. So for me, that's always the marker of, is my paper ready to go? Do I have something novel to say? Okay, so here is a brief sort of schematic of TCE in my mind, and I had the core kind of laid out here, and I was thinking about how have I augmented TCE, and I'm doing this not so you can see all the papers, etc., but just so I can show you how many things I've actually messed around with in this theory. So the first thing, or one of the first things that I've done, is think about opportunism as motivation, right? Not just one kind of motivation, but really digging into what kinds of opportunisms there are out there, and cooperation, bringing that in as well. And that was in a paper with Nikolai Foss and Lindenberg that's forthcoming. I've also spent a lot of time messing around with bounded rationality. Traditionally, in TCE, bounded rationality is all about incomplete contracts. Williamson was very specific about why he made that decision and why he didn't bring in cognitive biases, etc. But when we bring them in, we actually see that there's a bunch of different things that can happen here when we're talking about predictions, which are really interesting. And a lot of that work was around framing with Kyle Mayer and Chris Bauman that I did. The other thing that I'm working on right now is screwing around with asset specificity. So we have this implicit assumption in the theory that asset specificity is something that we, can determine almost objectively, right? And so when you start to think about perceptions and how those can change, that actually can change, especially when there are biases involved, the levels of asset specificity that may be perceived and the governance that is put into place here. And that's with Bruskhoff that I'm working on that right now. And then we actually have uncertainty. I did a paper again with Kyle, and this was looking at thinking about different kinds of uncertainties, so not just external uncertainty, but uncertainty that comes from cognition and different frames that people have. And then we have learning, which Nick has done some work in, which has been fascinating. And he actually was my AE on a paper where I really dug into the cognition of learning and what you learn under different kinds of contract frames, which is vastly different, even if the same event happens. So you can see here that there's a lot of places that you can poke on, prod, bring in all different kinds of psychology that makes this a really amazing theory to be able to do this with. So I'm going to dig into just two of these things a little bit more deeply here. So the first one, the first thing that I'm going to talk about is getting back to this idea of addressing a classic critique in TCE. So we have this opportunism critique, right? That it's this terrible assumption, right? Ryan's discussed why perhaps it's not as terrible as some of the critics think it is. But we have had calls by people who are in our area in the TCE research for more realistic motivations, right? We also have a critique of in TCE that a hierarchy is this panacea, right? That it's expensive, but it takes care of opportunism. So we don't really need to worry about that much, which has led to the critique that, you know, we haven't really addressed hierarchical failure very well. And so Nikolai and Sigwart and I decided, well, this is an opportunity, right? How can we actually think about how different hierarchical forms actually impact motivations here and make them more realistic? And so here, what we had to do is focus on opportunism, but expand these motivations, right? Here we linked hierarchical forms to goal frames, and then we link goal frames to cooperation or a type of opportunism. And the other thing that we did is identify when we had matched the efficient governance form when it wasn't going to fully mitigate these types of opportunism that came not only from the transaction characteristics, but also from these motivations inside of these different hierarchical forms. So for goal frames, this is just a quick and dirty primer here, but a normative goal frame makes you more collateral and status opportunism, which, you know, in this case, we're talking about a holdup specifically. And a hedonic goal frame is really about, you know, things that make you feel better. So effort, like I don't want to do this, I'm going to slack off, right? Free riding and visceral kinds of opportunisms. So what we were able to do is identify for each of these governance forms, and here we have a simple hierarchy, a U form, an M form, and a project matrix, a dominant goal frame, and then secondary goal frames, because that's the way that the theory works. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail here because of the limited amount of time, but essentially these led to different kinds of opportunistic motivations. Now, what was interesting is Williamson had thought about some of this, about internal opportunism before. So his 1986 chapter 10, there's this famous 2x2. And if you talk to Jackson Nickerson, I guarantee you'll have a conversation with him about it at some point in your life. And essentially, we use that to match these hierarchical forms with these different characteristics that he had laid out. And what we found is when we did that, the diagonals, it was fine. It addressed the kind of opportunism, but the off diagonals didn't. So now we have a hierarchical failure in two different kinds of hierarchical forms that we didn't know about before, right? Which gets back to what Nick said about formal governance and matching it, right? It's probably even more difficult than we thought it was, right? When we bring this kind of cognition in, because there are these other kinds of motivations that we don't realize. The other thing that I wanted to focus on just briefly is addressing a raging debate. And this is really getting back to the informal governance debate of whether contracts are complements or substitutes, right? This allowed for an opportunity to shift the questions to if they were to when they were, right? And this was all about bounded rationality. This was bringing framing in, and it was talking about identifying hidden assumptions. And here, the hidden assumption was that contracts were only used for prevention. It wasn't ever that contracts were used to promote the relationship. And that's what we brought in. This was Kyle and I. And so in doing that, you can predict when contracts are complements or substitutes. Here was the theory. Essentially, prevention contracts led to more negative emotions and less attribution of positive behavior to partners, where promotion contracts did the opposite. And so we were suggesting that there would be more trust under promotion than prevention contracts. And we started with the theory paper. Later, Chris Bauman and I actually tested this in an experiment, and lo and behold, we did find, right, that promotion contracts complement trust, but prevention contracts substitute for trust. So what I think is really cool and what's really a great opportunity here is that you saw all of those places that I poked around, right, in TCE. There's so many more, right? We're only beginning to scratch the surface, right? We had a great paper in the beginning by Jackson and Todd Zenger, right, on NV costs, for example. We haven't even discussed that here, right? There's just so much more we can do. But what's really interesting too is that some of these things can connect us to areas that we weren't connected to before, like org design, right? Thinking about internal governance and how to actually change it and be much more specific than just a hierarchical form, but what kinds of administrative controls do we need, for example. We can also link to leadership research, right? When we're thinking about this atmosphere that Nick was talking to. And we can go deeper into cognitive mechanisms inside organizational learning that we weren't able to before. So with that, thank you so much for letting me give a little overview of cognition. And if you're interested in talking about it, I can't stop talking about it. So please reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Libby. That's a fascinating presentation. Let's just take some questions from the audience. That's what we're here for as well today. So I don't know who went first, but Bonita, I believe, I hope I'm not messing up with the name. Would you like to unmute yourself and challenge the panelists? They like a good challenge, so don't be shy.
Thank you, Nuno. Thank you, Professor Weber. That was really interesting. To your point about aggregating at firm level, if you could speak to that a bit more, as in, does that mean there is a specific research methodology of collecting data at individual level and then working up through a hierarchical linear model up to a level of a firm level of analysis? Or could you detail that a bit more? How would we aggregate up?
So honestly, I think that the field is wide open for this at the moment. The way that I've gone about it is I've done work at different levels, right? Starting with, contracting research the way that we've typically have done it, and then looking at mechanisms using experiments underlying that. There are other ways that it could be done, though. So that's not the only way, right? I know that multi-method research is sometimes difficult to publish. What I've actually done is I've broken it up into different papers to get around that. But I think that if we look at this as a, sort of a building up of all of this theory together, then we can take those kinds of approaches as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? So I'll be interested in hearing from the panelists in terms of, talking about this multi-level, and it's also a challenge and at some point also an opportunity, I suspect, to develop theory. I'd like to hear in terms of what you see to be one big important challenge, and I'd like to end in a positive note. So how you think TCE can contribute to some of the very important questions of the future, and And what would be the other question, the issue? We think about TCE in terms of transactions between organizations, and some people find it very exciting, other people find it less so exciting. But perhaps there's a wider use and relevance of TCE. Anyone like to, any of the panelists or any member of the audience, if you have a brilliant idea, just share it. Maybe if I may, my question was a bit inspired by the review Brian and his colleagues. So if you don't mind to be on the spotlight, so what do you think to be the bright future of TCE in terms of addressing some of the important challenges? You covered the grand challenges, I believe, in the AMA review. So maybe you can speak a bit to that, and hopefully we'll motivate other speakers.
Was that directed at me, Nuno?
Yeah, yes, please, if that's okay.
Can I get away with saying everyone should read the article? I'm actually more interested in hearing what other people say. One of the things that excites me is something, I'm excited by the other things I've heard the other panelists say. Given the importance of platforms and ecosystems and digital technologies, I see that is an exciting area, and that's something we touched on a little bit in that in the paper to which you refer.
Thanks, Brian. Any other great ideas from any of the panelists? So maybe Nick, how do you plan to study informal organizations? Fascinating topic. I was very interested by that. So, any thoughts?
Well, I'll switch around and maybe drill down on something that Brian mentioned, which that. In TCE, we typically study relationships between buyers and suppliers, or we might study relationships between divisions within a firm, exchanges. One thing that is not explicitly in TCE is relationships between a platform owner and a complementer, a firm that produces a complement for the platform, but there may be no explicit exchange of good or service between the two, but yet they're in a transactional relationship. In many cases, maybe there's a licensing agreement, maybe there's not even a formal licensing agreement. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on analyzing what kinds of, how are those relationships governed, and what kinds of structures are efficient for governing relationships between platform owners and complementers, especially when we know there's a lot of scope for opportunism on both sides.
Thank you. I'm quite conscious about the time. It would be great if you could have the opportunity to have a coffee break and then continue the conversation. But I'm afraid we have to close the session for now. But I would like to thank all the panelists for the excellent presentations, and of course, STR for organizing this session. So thank you very much, Brian, Nick, Fabrice, and Libby. Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for attending. And I'll pass it on to Maka, if that's okay. I think that's what I should say.
Sure. Thank you, Nuno. So let me end by thanking you for the thoughtful organization of the session and invitation of panelists and the description of topics. I think that panelists' discussions really complemented and provided an integrative view of the topic. Of course, 90 minutes could not do justice to the depth and breadth of ideas in TCE. And although we try to do best, I hope this is just the beginning of the conversation. And in further conferences and other interactions, our audience can interact more with panelists and perhaps build on the contributions through a scholarly research so that we can continue this line of thought. So thanks again to all of you for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the summer, and see you in the Academy of Management.